Saw is an awkward midquel shoved in an already awkward franchise. Even more awkwardly is that the game wants really badly to be Silent Hill. Silent Hill's combat being bad isn't a hot take, it's well known, but emulating it in 2009 is a strange idea. In fact, this was apparently ordered by the publisher of the game, Konami, who picked up the game after various issues and wanted to make it a spiritual successor to their own famous horror franchise. To call a licensed game of all things a successor to Silent Hill is completely absurd. Or is it? Yes, it is. While technically being a midquel, the game is much more similar to a few of the later entries. Development began before Saw 3 was released, but didn't come out until Saw 5 had. Saw 3 clearly had a large influence on the development. The plot is very nearly the same, at least in a general sense. While it lacks the A-plot of that movie, with Jigsaw on his deathbed, the game almost beat for beat copies the B-plot of the third entry of the series. It is essentially a loop of wandering around in the dark, dodging instant kill traps until David reaches the end of a stage, completing a set of mini-games to free the victim, and repeating until the end. The main character of Saw is David Tapp, a former cop. For those unfamiliar with Saw, he was a major character in the first movie played by Danny Glover, who of course does not return for the game. Spoilers from a 15-year-old movie, he gets dead. Granted, games are no stranger to committing back alive, and the Saw franchise probably would stoop to it if there wasn't a better idea. Tapp is put through the events of the games to face his obsession with Jigsaw, an obsession that has caused him to put the truth above the safety of others. The various characters he interacts with are a mix of original characters, or mostly original characters expanded from as little as a name on a prop, and returning characters, some of which wouldn't appear in canon until after the events of the game. Gameplay is divided into two major sections: puzzle solving and combat. The puzzles in the game are generally various minigames, all of which gate progression in various ways, although some are generally just for gaining extra items. These include smaller traps such as the shotgun doors, which are essentially just a QTE, and many other QTE minigames such as the toilet and acid barrel item grabs and the game's opener, the reverse bear trap, but also includes a number of larger puzzle types. While it's hard to call them interesting, they certainly beat the combat. These puzzles include lockpicking, which is essentially matching colors in a circle, fuse boxes, which require connecting glowing lights to power circuits by rotating wires to light the whole mess, somewhat like Pipe Mania, pipe rotating, which is more or less as it sounds, and is easily the worst of the minigames, and gear placement, which requires connecting two gears using gears of 3 different sizes that can only be placed on specific nodes, arguably the most interesting puzzle of the bunch. These puzzles all have a limited number of variations that are randomly chosen at the checkpoint, meaning as the game goes on you'll likely see repeats. It's also worth noting that fuse boxes come in various sizes, 3x3, 5x5, and 7x7, while the others never seem to have any variance in difficulty outside of some puzzles being randomly easier or harder. The game also often asks the player to find combinations for locks in certain areas. And while some of these are fairly clever, such as using mirrors to merge writing on a wall and writing on a mirror together, it's often found plainly written on a wall or behind a pile of enemies. Interestingly, these numbers aren't randomized in any way. The speedrun for this game takes huge advantage of this by skipping large sections of the game that only exist to find these combinations. Level 6 can be shortened to around a minute because the combination door to the end of the level is found about 30 seconds from the start. Lone Shark Joe has videos of his runs if you're interested in seeing someone completely avoid playing the game.
Like you alive.
You're throwing away your life.
Jesus Christ! Jesus Christ!
Oddly, one puzzle involving lining up numbers never displayed right to me. I actually ended up looking up the solution, and even knowing where I was supposed to stand could only seem to get 1 or 2 numbers lined up, which may have been an issue with playing in widescreen over HDMI, which would have been far less common in 2009. There are also a few unique puzzles that I'll cover in the section covering the game's levels. A big portion of this puzzle solving exists due to another smaller aspect of the game, which is exploration. It ain't New Vegas, but there are often a lot of paths branching out that contain health, weapons, or crafting items. Wandering around is fairly dangerous though, as the game is filled with tons and tons and tons of instant kill tripwires that do nothing but slow the game down to a crawl, because if you move too fast, you're liable to...
Are you barefoot? Oh shit, Luck. Getting across that glass is gonna hurt. Aren't getting my shoes.
The game also likes to put broken glass on the ground, a trap that moderately drains your health if you touch it. Thanks to quality graphic design, this glass usually blends in with the other trash lying on the floor. It's very fun. This game is also very dark. My TV does tend to run moderately dark, but even at maximum brightness, the game tends towards Ray Charles mode. There are 3 light sources, but it's really a choice of lesser evil. The lighter gives a radius of dim orange light, which I found to be generally the most helpful, and has the added benefit of allowing you to use Molotovs. Not that they're very useful, but there's also a section early in the game where using the lighter can cause you to get burned as well, and it goes out if you move too quickly. Yeah, for real. The flashlight puts a concentrated beam of light in front of you, but because the game is so clunky and cluttered, and because of the
Advanced darkness.
it was almost unusable for me. The camera, I'm convinced, is a joke. Using the flash illuminates everything for about a half second, but takes around a full second to recharge while adding a motion blur effect to the screen. Exploring and navigating is rarely fun or worth it, especially considering that outside of getting health items or weapons, which themselves only have between 1 and 6 uses before breaking, you only get crafting materials. Some are required to activate puzzles, but often your inventory will be filled with wires and shotgun shells that can only be used to rearm traps for an enemy to walk into in the rare situation that those 2 things align, and crafting materials that can only be used to make some mediocre traps that you can only carry 1 of at a time. These traps can also only be crafted if you went out of your way to find their recipe and to find a workbench, which don't start appearing until about halfway through the game anyway, and appear so scarcely that if you use the traps, they'll likely be gone for an hour or more, which is a lot in a 5-ish hour game. The combat is bad. Even in a game like Silent Hill, the combat is generally consistent. Saw rarely feels consistent. Combat often boils down to who has the fastest weapon at best, because swinging weapons takes so long. Big weapons like bats and pipes swing very slowly, and unless your opponent also has a bat, you'll likely take a lot of hits. But if you run around with something small or no weapons, you can likely stunlock your opponent to death. The block doesn't seem to function at all for the most part, although once I did get a perfect block and got a QTE to kill my enemy. Despite my attempts, I never got another block. The block button combined with pressing back also allows David to backstep, which, while sometimes useful, still feels clunky and inconsistent. If you get backed into a corner, you might as well load a save, as you'll get stunlocked and be unable to dodge and will very slowly die to whatever enemy is in front of you. This is of course talking about the fighting when it works, which isn't always the case. Sometimes it's more like... As for weapon types, you're looking at heavies, bats, pipes, etc., which are borderline useless, lights such as lamps and mannequin arms, which are better but no more fun, and unarmed, which allows you to stunlock most armed enemies to death, and then the miscellanea, revolvers, which are 6 shots of instant kill. As you may expect, the shooting is pretty bad, but the auto-aim is generous enough to make it a good option for deleting problems. There are also some insta-kill melee weapons like scissors and syringes, which are a one-shot kill on most enemies but also break after 1 use, and finally explosives. Molotovs are not good. And the craftable traps don't tend to be much better, and can only be placed in a stationary spot, meaning after placing it you have to bait enemies into it. The explosive trap is probably the only useful one, as it does a fair amount of damage. The gas trap drains enemies' health over time, which means you probably would have finished them off quicker without it, and the stun trap does borderline nothing. Enemy variety is about as low as my IQ. There are regular enemies who can wield different weapons, including Molotovs, shotgun callers who need to be defeated quickly otherwise you auto-die, although getting far enough away from them will make them auto-die, box heads who take less damage but are completely blind, bomb hands who explode when they die. The game wants you to kill these guys with traps or other methods of not getting near, but you can usually tank the hit and there are only about 3 or 4 in the game. And lastly, strongmen who take and give more damage but are otherwise the same. There's also a final boss, yes really, that I will cover as it becomes relevant. In case I didn't make it clear in the first part of this section on combat, it's not good. The control is never solid, but in combat all the issues of tight corridors and darkness expand into a nightmare, and not the kind I'm sure they were aiming for. Also, quick side note, the game has 2 difficulties, normal and insane. The only difference in insane is that enemies go from taking 2 to 3 hits generally, to taking enough to break any weapon you have in one encounter, while also being able to kill you in 2 or 3 hits. The mode has no change to puzzles, which is especially odd considering that the circuit boxes have larger and smaller sizes, and that the meat of the game is puzzles. Every boss in this game, outside of the one actual boss, is either a unique or timed puzzle challenge. Needless to say, avoid insane mode. As far as aesthetics go, the game is generally poor. Outside of the aforementioned darkness, which completely ruins the game visually as it is, the game has virtually nothing going on. Environments tend towards lifeless, dirty gray hallways, and the enemies are usually just guys in t-shirts. There's some cool designs with the traps, but even those are usually covered up in darkness. For a game so dark, it's shocking that there isn't a better use of light anywhere throughout it to create contrast. The only time I can remember something that came remotely close to feeling horror was the face of a dead man stuck in a wall sometime during Chapter 5, which stands out only because it's ironically the one breath of life I noticed in the level design. The music is another sour spot, as it's borderline non-existent. Hello Zep is left out of the game entirely despite being the main and recurring theme of the series. Much of the game is filled with ambience, which can work, but with a game as lifeless as this, and with so little to look at, instead of a sense of eeriness, you only get dullness in waves as thick as the darkness. The game has 13 ambience tracks, but none of them add to the ambience the game wants to provide. The only 2 tracks that stand out are the main menu theme and the clue jingle. The final boss has a cool track, but if you beat it efficiently, you'll hear maybe 30 seconds at most. The tracks aren't bad at their own, but they're so badly utilized in the game that you won't notice them very often. Voice acting in the game is also generally poor. Enemies all seem to share a handful of generic lines performed equally generically between them. David sounds nothing like Danny Glover, who has a very commanding presence in the movie. The obvious standout for the voice acting is Tobin Bell, who actually does return for the role of Jigsaw, whereas he tends to do, he breathes a lot of life into the game. Unfortunately, Jigsaw's role is fairly small, never appearing on screen and only appearing as a voice that serves to somewhat guide the player. Amanda is the first chapter of the game, and in general is very tutorial-y. This chapter tends to be bogged down with lots of tutorial text boxes. A lot of stuff is pretty self-explanatory. Do I really need to be told that putting a fuse in the fuse box allows me to use the button right next to it? Despite this, the game lacks good explanations for a lot of other things. The game never once tells you how to drop traps. The combat is explained in terms of control, but never in how to actually wrangle it into somewhat working. A lot of the gameplay is fairly standard, with a basic loop of walking around, getting brained by shotguns, and solving basic puzzles, then occasionally fighting an enemy. This pattern carries through most of the game, so I won't mention it unless it becomes important. There is something of a puzzle partway through where you have to match a toe tag on a body to an X-ray to find a key, but the only punishment for failing is having to fight another enemy. The other big puzzle before the end of the level is one that involves turning out the lights to see a glow-in-the-dark symbol you need to match at the door, a mechanic that is strangely only used once despite being something of a callback to the first movie. Speaking of callbacks, the end of the chapter is a unique puzzle starring Amanda, an important character from the first 3 or so movies. It's a simple game of getting red balls into red zones and blue balls into blue zones. It's a pretty straightforward puzzle with figuring out the path ahead of time, and it doesn't seem to have a time limit. Even for a tutorial, it's disappointingly easy for the first boss challenge, as it were. In general, a lot of the puzzles in this game are fairly simple outside of maybe the 7x7 electric grids. After saving Amanda, she's quickly captured by Pighead, presumably as a ruse because she is a Jigsaw apprentice, unless the game is implying that this is where she was turned, which some of the movies mostly contradict.
Everything's in place now. Good luck, Captain.
In Jennings, the game begins to introduce some of its more complex elements, like the shotgun collar enemies that need to be killed quickly, and the introduction of gear puzzles, the pipe puzzles, and my favorite, the shotgun traps. But truthfully, at this point, the game has already shown you most of its hand, with very little new to show besides dumber enemies and more puzzles. One of the new additions is the acid barrels, which are the same as the toilet searches, but the key isn't visible. I have no idea how this one works, but I've never failed one, so I guess I'm good at it. This level also has the first of the pig puzzles, which are just awkward third-person versions of the board game Rush Hour. The only unique aspect to the level is the steam valves, which are just switches that block progression. This level also leans a lot more into the game's really poor combat. The boss puzzle is literally just the gear puzzle, but 4 times and on a timer. There are a few more unique puzzles coming up, but the game really likes reusing the same few puzzles but sticking timers on them. After saving Jennings, he runs off without you. Prepare to see this happen a lot. Chapter 3, Melissa, is one of the few with relevant story beats. Melissa is the wife of David's partner in the first film, and she blames David for her husband's death. Like Jennings, she runs off after being saved. Like I said, the game has shown its whole hand.
I'm sorry, David. You deserve this. He said if I made it this far, I could choose to leave. I'm leaving, and I'm not sorry. Goodbye.
But unlike anyone else, becomes relevant to one of the endings. The game gives you one of your few choices in its otherwise linear design here. One route making you go through instant death traps, while the other asks you to wander in the dark without bursting yourselves into flames. The only unique puzzle, using the term very loosely, is one that simply requires you to find Detective Singh's clearly marked grave. You also need to smash some angel statues, but that's even less of a puzzle since you'll find the key in one of them eventually, and I don't think there's a real indication as to which is the correct one. Melissa's Trap is a Pokemon ice block pushing puzzle, and not much more. Certainly unique for this game, but it's all been done before and better. Silent Hill did it all better, Pokemon did it better, and I'm sure at least one of these minigame puzzles has been done better in Mario Party. Chapter 4 is Oswald, with the victim being some guy whose name was on a newspaper on a wall in one scene of the first Saw movie. Yes, really. This level has you hunt down puzzle pieces to do an actual puzzle. Thrilling, I know. You can skip a large section of the second half of this level just by knowing the combination to the lock on the door. The only thing you'll miss is more of the same horrible combat and samey puzzles. After completing the puzzle, Oswald's Trap is just more of the circuit grids, but again, they added a timer. Same shit, different room. Obi is an interesting chapter, not because the game decided to become good, but because Obi is an important character in Saw 2, which takes place a few months after this game. His characterization isn't very consistent with that movie, but it comes together decently well. Also, Oswald accidentally kills himself after you save him, a nice and meaningful twist that really makes you feel like Saw the video game. IGN gives Saw a 8.5 out of 10. This chapter has literally nothing new in it, and Obi's Trap is the terrible Valve minigame but 3 times and on a timer, because this game is out of ideas. To really hammer this point home, Obi runs off and ditches you.
I can't stand by as you throw away this gift from Jigsaw.
In Chapter 6, you rescue Jeff, another minor character from the first film. The only new element in this chapter is a minigame where you throw bricks at pigs to knock them into a grinder, but you have unlimited tries. The cool part about this chapter is that it can be completed in roughly 2 minutes simply by knowing the code to the door at the start, skipping basically everything in the entire level. Jeff's Trap at the end of the level is a very simple game of memory. You know, that game that 5-year-olds play? Thank God the last chapter is here. Tap. This level includes the game's only boss battle, and it's a bad one. Pighead is more or less a regular enemy with a really big health bar and really big damage numbers. The game expects this to be a long, dramatic fight, and leaves you areas that you can bait him into to use traps against him, but I simply laid down all of my traps and wailed on him a few times to get him down in seconds. The combat is so bad and awkward that one hit from him is almost certainly death, but simply going hard on him will probably work most of the time. There's a few more sections of gameplay, but it's more of the same stuff that the game has shown over and over again. The game has 2 endings, and like all lazy games, it's decided by choosing a door at the end of the game. I'll first cover the canon ending, Freedom. In Freedom, Detective Tapp frees all the people he saved, which isn't shown in the cutscene, and you get one more cutscene of Tapp shooting himself in the head. The whole ending, despite being canon to the sequel, feels like it was whipped together in an afternoon so that they could put multiple endings on the box. It's almost bafflingly lacking as it doesn't show a single second of any of the other survivors, and the credits roll on a small TV that makes the whole thing look awkward and out of place. The other ending, despite being non-canon, feels like the correct ending. Unlike the former ending, the truth ending has a few extra minutes of gameplay. Again, it's nothing special, but includes the very Saw-like reveal that Melissa was forced to build traps and keep Tap in the games. Not realizing she isn't Jigsaw, Tap beats her to death, and then gets put into a mental asylum. I certainly wouldn't call this ending good, but it does follow the formula of the movies with its big twist and reveal, and at least unlike Freedom, it is an actual ending. Deciding the endings is handled very poorly. Simply put, actually choosing the ending is just lazy. If it were up to me, I'd probably make it, depending on how many survivors you saved, make it so that they can die, except maybe Melissa. Make Melissa the first one from the tutorial so she can't die, and axe Amanda and Obi. Saving everyone gets you the good ending, while anything less causes you to get the truth ending. Have survivors give you items for saving them to motivate players to save them. Dunno, just spitballing. Also, flesh out the damn Freedom ending. The game does have a tiny amount of bonus features, but they can't even do that right. The bonus features are all concept art and galleries, which is whatever. But instead of some menu to flip through, they're all saved as FMV files, and displayed with way too much compression, and you can't pause or choose which ones to look at. To wrap this whole mess of a game up, as an adaptation or continuation in a way of the series, it's actually fairly true to the source. It's brutal, it's edgy, it's often bad, and it tries too hard. Nods to the series are nice, but what really makes it feel like it fits into the series are odd, mismatched tones, the big dumb twist, in the non-canon ending anyway, and in a sense, the way it awkwardly merges its awful combat and mediocre puzzles feels very similar to the way the movies always feel like an awkward blend of ideas. The series itself is generally a clunky, awkward mess of ideas, retcons, twists, and an attempt to shock. Saw is a bad game, undoubtedly. Perhaps it's even terrible. But that's not so different from the movies it's based on, despite how much I like them. As a game, my feelings should be obvious. It's borderline unplayable, almost every aspect of it is bad, and anything that isn't is just generic puzzles. The game is repetitive, so repetitive that you'll probably see each variation of each puzzle 5 times in one playthrough, and wears out its tricks very quickly. Almost nothing new is introduced after the second chapter, and it rarely tries to be anything more than basic. To call it a successor to Silent Hill as Konami wanted is a joke, but the game lacks even the most basic of legs to stand on, even compared to how clunky the Silent Hill series can be, and for a horror game it really lacks the basic element of horror. The game feels like a frustrating maze of terrible combat and instant death traps leading to nothing more than Mario Party minigames repeated ad nauseum. The game only ever really tests one skill, and that's memory. Once you memorize the general puzzle layouts and how they work, you just put all the pieces together as quickly as possible. When you do die, it's almost always to the damn shotgun trap, so when you reload, you just walk around them the second time. This game is borderline substanceless, and the lack of a story of any kind doesn't make it any more cohesive. Even still, it's hard to say I'm disappointed, as I never really expected it to be good. The game isn't a successor to Silent Hill, but in its own way, it serves as a good and bad successor to the series of movies that it clearly has some reverence for.